The family of the late President Mwai Kibaki, Your Excellencies, party leaders, you have all been recognized. The only ones who have not been recognized individually are our flavor of the month, Justin Muturi, my whip when I was a minister under Kibaki, Norman Nyaga. Ladies and gentlemen, for purposes of turning this into a conversation involving all of you, I will keep within the time limit, but also say things that others have not said. Quite a bit of what I wanted to say has been said, particularly by Professor Kagwanja, aligning national, international, and domestic policy with identified national priorities. But if you may allow me, I want to reminisce, not in a way of remembering what Kibaki did, but in raising our collective challenge of the moment in the light of how Kibaki dealt with it. And for this, I think I start with a sound reading of the situation. I start with the earliest time I had intense interaction with the late president was around the year 2000 when we were trying to build a coalition of the opposition. And what he was exuding of as a leader was being so comfortable in your own standing that you don't try too hard to impose yourself as the leader. That through the period when we were bonding, it was very difficult. There were real spoilers, and Norman, you were present. You could hear Mwai Kibaki, Martin Shkuku go off about you Kikuyus and what you have done to us. And Matu Amai reply with how much we have the money and we have the people, will just remember and sympathize with you. But Kibaki had to rein in all these extremes and accommodate without overemphasizing his role as the leader. But to me, this also indicated an underlying strength that Kibaki had, and it ran through his leadership. He was clever enough to know that he was not adequate in everything. I never know clever people who think they know everything. When you find such people, they're not clever. Yeah. And being adequately clever meant that he tried to identify talent that he could nurture, but he could also assign responsibilities to persons that he thought could perform. But to me, the most important evidence of his sense of clever enough to feel inadequate was the importance he placed on the creation of a National Economic and Social Council. I think one of the most important features that really set up the beacons for the Kibaki presidency was to say, if you are sailing without a rudder, you can end up where you came from instead of the right destination. And you cannot overstate the importance of the National Economic and Social Council and one of its products, Vision 2030, in aligning immediate political priorities with long-term identified national agenda that is depersonalized, that is not a Kibaki agenda, but an agenda for Kenya. Secondly, the humility of Kibaki surprised many of us when we were building the early phase of the government. Like many of you can remember, within the very first cabinet meeting I think we had, President Kibaki introduced to cabinet a proposal that we donate Cabernet Gardens to Daniel Arap Moi. At that time, some ministers were telling Kano people, you sit back, you didn't know how to rule, we show you how to rule, you are thieves. But here's a president who has been humiliated by Moi for years, saying, let us get out of the way a sense that you can be vindictive. Let us be larger than the conduct and behavior of those from whom we are taking power. Can we have the strength to say, we retire you with respect and donate to you a public asset you did not steal for all the years you're president? I want to finish off with a bit about humility, because recently I listened to something and I said, can you imagine President Mwai Kibaki saying, don't you know I am the president? You know, when you are not adequate in yourself that you are holding an office, you look for external assurances that you are actually the boss that you're holding that office. But Kibaki was too big for that kind of pettiness. And every time I hear anybody say, don't you know I am what? I miss Mwai Kibaki. Now, when Kibaki appointed me minister, there are 3 areas that were immediately challenging and important to us. We, the Right Honorable Stephen Kalonzo Musyoka, we were members of Council of East African Community and were in the final phase of negotiating a customs union for East Africa, which we did around Christmas 2005. The challenges we had were the contrasting national interests of Tanzania and Kenya, and Tanzania and Uganda, and Kenya and Uganda. For example, Tanzanians consume much more wheat in chapati than anybody else in East Africa in per capita terms. And therefore, as a country without production of any significant quantities of wheat, Tanzania will always want the cheapest, the lowest duty on wheat because of the chapati interest. Now, Kenya has some wheat farmers, like Kipia and a few other places, not sufficient for our national interest, but requiring some protection from cheap wheat brought in under a low tariff on wheat products. And there we were, stuck in discussions with Tanzania. And we'll come back to Mwai Kibaki and he says, lazima tuonyeshe interest kwamba tunataka huu umoja wetu, it is important to us. But don't sacrifice Kenyan farmers for that umoja. Similarly, we had a challenge with Uganda. The state in Uganda was dominated by mercantilist capitalists, importers of low-cost merchandise from Eastern Asia and trying to quickly turn a profit. But Kenya had a manufacturing base for some of the things Ugandan merchants were importing. So while Kenya wanted to protect capital goods and protect finished products which can be made in Kenya from being liberalized, Uganda wanted as low a tariff as possible on imports of goods which would be sold around. But you know, as we walked this tight road of keeping friends, but also defining what is in the national interest, Kibaki was giving us 2 directions. We must belong together and only make concessions if we can now create domestic policy to become competitive and defeat the threat that comes with those concessions. If we're liberalizing wheat, what shall we do not to kill the wheat production in Kenya? If we want to be friends with Uganda, how can we not sacrifice the people who are making some significant products that are otherwise being imported cheaply by the traders who want lower tariffs on those finished goods? I say this because aligning actual national production interest with treaty building was a feature of leadership that has disappeared in our politics. Today is like we put saliva on the finger and we check where the direction of the wind is. Today I want that to be my friend, whether it is Kosovo or it is the rapid deployment forces. You say, how does this align with the national interest? There was no such conversation. There's also something that I want to say that has not been properly mentioned. Mwai Kibaki believed in cabinet government. The president had ideas of what he wanted done, but he was ready to modify or even suspend those ideas on the basis of discussion within the cabinet. I was impressed at how, in some of the areas, he knew better than most of us, but he had the humility as a leader to give every person a chance. And then when we're coming towards the end, he says, is there anybody who's opposing that position? For those of us who have not been in another cabinet, we're outraged when we hear about persons who use cabinet as a rubber stamp of personal decisions, because it never worked under Kibaki. And that way it gave us a strength to prosecute what the president was declaring in public, because we owned it as part of collective government. I had the privilege to be part of a delegation of Mwai Kibaki on a state visit to Thailand. And at the state dinner, I asked the Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been one of the most successful leaders in the Eastern Asian financial crisis at the turn of the century, what he had done for Thailand to recover from the financial crisis so rapidly compared to others. And when Shinawatra said, what we did is to believe that if a tree is wilting, you don't pour water to the leaves, you pour at the stem, that you start building from the bottom, the most effective bottom-up thinking. And it struck me so much, as so similar to what Mwai Kibaki had done in Kenya. In the first few months of becoming president, he brought through cabinet an urgent resolution that we buy back KCC, the Kenya Creameries, which had been taken off by Moi and his son and a few others. And we got it back, and it immediately had an impact on the resuscitation of the dairy industry in this country. So walking the talk, believing that you align your international engagements with domestic responsibilities, and when you identify inadequacies, you deal with them. And importantly, reducing government borrowing in the domestic money markets to make credit affordable by entrepreneurs were key drivers to turning around a country which had problems similar to what we have today, but leadership very different. Thank you for your attention.